was one menacing film character, man. He's totally gonna make that stupid AFI Top 100 all-time villains list. Yeah, but did you notice the complete absence of a film score? Look, I understand minimalism, but if I were directing, I would have totally used some simple refrains to pitch moments.
Is it possible that you could talk a bit quieter? Or more intelligently?
Whoa, dude, what's your problem?
The director doesn't put the music into a film, that's the scorer.
Yeah, I know that. I'm just saying if I was directing...
Well, you didn't direct it, did you? You watched it. With your popcorn.
I don't eat popcorn. Yeah, I'm here. All right, let's see how it's doing at the box office.
Pretty fast with that thing, aren't you?
Yeah, listen, old man, I got a Core 2 Duo processor, 2 gigabytes of RAM. Yeah, probably means nothing to you. Oh, here we go. 34 million at the box office. Not bad for a Western.
What does that mean? For a Western?
Westerns? Man's gotta do what a man's gotta do. Empty, elliptical, cornball shit. Ow! Son of a bitch!
You ever seen Unforgiven, Kid?
What? No.
Well, you should.
You were smart to change your mind, kid.
Yeah?
Yeah, I'm a real good shot with this rifle. Here, see that hawk up there? I could hit that hawk with one shot.
Hell, I could hit it too, Ned, if I didn't mind wasting a shot.
There ain't no hawk, kid. You can't see for shit, can you?
See, you're exactly the kind of short-sighted 20-nothing that Clint Eastwood was addressing in that film.
What film?
How many Westerns have you watched?
Does Blazing Saddles count? Hey! Hey, that's my laptop. What are you doing? You smashed my fingers, man.
Good! Start your own weblog.
When do we get to wherever the hell you're taking me?
When? When? What, is this not processing fast enough for you? Behold, the natural world, brought to your attention.
There's nothing out here, man.
You said the Western was dead.
Yeah?
Well, that might be true. But the day it started dying was the day it got interesting, and you and I are going to discuss what killed it.
Okay, I get it. This is a documentary, like An Inconvenient Truth.
No, that was a PowerPoint presentation. This is film history.
Why me?
Well, you're interested in film, aren't you?
Modern film, dude.
What's your favorite?
Well, my top 5 favorite films are Taxi Driver.
Taxi Driver. Interesting.
Well, what'll it be? Lemon, strawberry, or lilac, sodbuster?
You speaking to me?
I don't see nobody else standing there.
Okay, everyone has influences.
Now we're getting somewhere. You don't get modern film without Westerns any more than you get Led Zeppelin without Muddy Waters.
Who?
All Westerns start the same. A man or men on horseback against a sweeping backdrop. Now, why do you think that is?
Oh, because they're Westerns?
Because you have to see the contrast, the juxtaposition of humanity against nature. Look at these mountains. You see that they're resilient, they're unchanging.
Well, they are changing. They're eroding.
Exactly. They're mutable and immutable. That's the paradox.
Who cares? Movies are about characters, man. You gotta have an arc. A character arc?
What are you, Moses?
Actually, I think you mean Noah.
All Westerns are about individualism versus evil encroachment, set against a backdrop of spires, buttes, and endless sky. That's a simple but eloquent story, and America is a simple but eloquent nation. See you later.
Hello? Hold on. You're leaving me here?
I'm sure there's Wi-Fi a couple miles in that direction.
Hey! My movies and my music! This has a DRAM video card!
I'm a rolling stone all alone.
The West is far more than just a place. It's an idea. That idea has always represented promise and a new beginning. In other words, a myth.
The appeal of the Wild West essentially is the all-American story. It's the place where the folk history of the nation is created.
This is the course of American history. The country was founded by these sturdy pioneers, and the country was built sort of from the bottom up. The westward movement, the civilizing of the continent. This is what its values are, and that's a very comforting sort of myth.
And presiding over this myth is one figure that all Americans are familiar with.
If there's one kind of mythical figure who sort of stands for America, it would be the cowboy.
The cowboy is tough-talking, upstanding, moral, honest, and in a sense is the ideal American. And this carries an immense resonance with the American population.
Since Jimmy Carter, all of our presidents have vacillated between being folksy, simple-talking Southerners or simple-talking Westerners. You know, good old boys or good old cowboys. So when President Bush uses phrases like, either you're with us or you're against us, he knows exactly how that vernacular hits home with Americans. We're at war with Iraq because some Bible-thumping, tongue-tied, pretzel-choking fuckwit of a president actually convinced enough people he was some kind of laconic Gary Cooper hero, come to bring justice against the evil folks. You know, an armed savage uprising. That the majority of Americans bought into this while the rest of the world looked on a bit skeptically shows just how much Westerns have shaped our perception of evil. Bush claims that his favorite film is High Noon. Of course it is. A man standing tall and alone against a gang of thugs come to terrorize the town. First he tries to summon up some help. You know, a coalition of the willing, but we all know what it is. It's a posse.
I guess you all know why I'm here. I need deputies. I'll take all I can get.
You must be crazy coming in here to raise a posse. Frank's got friends in this room. You ought to know that.
Now, this scene runs a minute 23, and that's exactly a minute 23 more than Bush actually spent trying to muster UN support for the invasion of Iraq.
We all know what Miller's like. That's why I'm here. How about it?
Bush never really got his posse together, and like Gary Cooper, he has to go it alone. Nowadays, your average middle management Microsoft monkey would claim that that's not heroic at all. That's a person who can't maximize the resources available to him. In other words, the dude can't network. What makes America the exceptional country that it is? Its frontier past. Not its real frontier past, its imagined frontier past, the one portrayed in films. What Bush has managed to do is to make a mockery of this past by invoking it and then failing to live up to its promise. Compare High Noon to the favorite film of a previous president, Harry S. Truman. When John Ford's My Darling Clementine was first screened at the White House in 1946, Truman claimed it was the best film he'd ever seen. At this point, John Ford had already won 3 Academy Awards and was well on his way to becoming the godfather of the Western. My Darling Clementine is his almost utopian vision of post-World War II America. There's a joke here I'm not going to touch with a 10-foot pole. It's easy to see why the film resonated with the president. A year earlier, Truman had made the most devastating military decision in history, to drop atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It was a decision most Americans deemed justifiable, but there was no escaping the barbarism of killing hundreds of thousands of innocent civilians. And this paradox is at the root of My Darling Clementine. It's based on a real incident, the gunfight at the OK Corral, October 26, 1881, in which Wyatt Earp, his brothers, and a dentist-turned-gambler named Doc Holliday battled a gang of cattle rustlers called the Clantons.
Shave, please.
Well, we sure want to thank you, Mr. Earp. Wyatt Earp.
What?
You're not by any chance the marshal from Dodge City?
Ex-marshal.
In the film, Wyatt Earp, played by Henry Fonda, finds his younger brother gunned down by the Clantons. So we think this is going to be a film about revenge. But that's not what Ford gives us. When James is murdered, the brothers bury him. And Earp reiterates the very manifesto that Truman himself was promising after the horrors of 6 years of war.
I'm gonna be around here for a while. Can't tell. Maybe when we leave this country, young kids like you will be able to grow up and live safe.
Earp becomes Marshal of Tombstone, not driven by vengeance, but by a desire to keep the peace. The name Tombstone invokes death, but the focus is clearly on birth, progress, culture, religion. It's a world totally out of whack.
Here's mighty entertainment that combines the exciting action of reckless pioneer days, the romantic conflicts of men and women who led perilous lives.
We're through talking, Marshal. My advice to you is start carrying your gun. That's good advice.
Earp's nemesis is Doc Holliday, the transplanted Easterner. In a way, you could say that Holliday represents America's barbarous past, whereas Earp represents its affirmative future. And he spends a lot of the film doing everything he can to avoid violence. For a man of action, he spends a lot of time just sitting. He's more or less happy to just watch progress unfold. He falls in love with Doc Holliday's ex-girlfriend, Clementine. When they attend the church dance together, Ford shows us one of the all-time unforgettable Western set pieces, the unfinished Tombstone Church, an apparition of the future, the image of clear-sailing prosperity that Truman's America was desperate for. And when Wyatt Earp tentatively attempts to dance, we know his transition from nomadic cattleman to pillar of society is complete. Only then does Ford give us what we've been waiting for, the showdown at the OK Corral. We've spent the whole film waiting for it, but when it happens, it only lasts a few minutes. Roughly the same amount of time it took for a bomber plane to find its target and unload over Hiroshima. And when the film ends, Earp no longer embraces the virtues of civilization he's acquired. He kisses Clementine goodbye and heads back into the wilderness, as if he knows that he has to keep guard to protect the transcendent future of the town that he's left behind. John Ford's progressive vision of Tombstone came true, but in the most perverted way possible. Because today, Tombstone is a Disney-fied tourist mecca. Here you can order sarsaparilla in Doc Holliday's favorite saloon, or treat yourself to a $10 Earp burger. I suppose that's the curse of becoming legendary.
Show starts in a few minutes, straight down the street, folks.
In America, our history, you could just reach over your shoulder and it's right there. And I think you'd have a hard time telling these guys that they were actors, because I think they're living out their childhood fantasy, to be cowboys. How cool is that?
It's morning, and this plot of ground is soon to be the site of death's indifference to life's claim on flowering youth and light.
The daily gunfight now lasts a full hour, because as we all know, nowadays a good fight is a protracted one. You want your money's worth.
Tombstone has a very rich history. It was the last of the big-time boom towns. And I have worked 40 years now to try to keep the history alive and keep it correct like it really happened.
Hey, Holiday, you heard about that new ordinance? If you ain't got a badge, you ain't supposed to carry your guns in town.
Well, the gunfight at OK Corral, according to some of the old people that I met when I first came here, who were children at the time, told me that the gunfight didn't amount to much here. People just kind of wrote it off as an ordinary happening.
I count at least 5 or 6 of them. Much as I hate to say it, we might could use Holiday on this.
I don't think it became famous until late 1920s. Probably started when Walter Noble Burns put out his book Tombstone.
If you're afraid to fight, boys, if you're afraid to die, you'd better stay out of the Badlands where the red-hot bullets fly.
Was Tombstone a fairly peaceful town before this gunfight?
No. Tombstone was never a peaceful town. Tombstone, from the very first, had shootings and knifings and fights and whatever. And it was a rough, tough town. It was never a peaceful town.
If you're afraid of dying.
Whether these people were renegades or whether they were outlaws or whatever, they were the best of the American people. I mean, they were determined, they were strong people, they were tough, resilient. They had to be to come to a place like Tombstone, which is nothing but cat claw, cactus, and full of Apaches, and make a town here. Now, the ordinary person today could not do that.
Right from the earliest days, Westerns were the dominant genre in Hollywood, to the extent that somewhere between 20 and 25% of all Hollywood feature films were Westerns, year in, year out.
In fact, over 7,000 films that could be labeled as Westerns have been released since the 1920s, which is pretty astonishing considering the frontier time span lasted from only 1865 to 1890. Only a few of these films are memorable. Why? Well, you could argue that a good Western is one that shows us a new experience rather than a redundant one, that shows us how we've been lied to in the past. But the truth is that all Westerns are lies. All the incarnations of Wyatt Earp have painted him as a good guy, a quiet avenger. Why? Because the legend of Wyatt Earp was created by Earp himself.
Wyatt Earp outlived everybody else that was involved. I have to say that he was not a paragon of virtue. He could say anything he wanted to, and there was nobody left to dispute him.
There is an interaction in the West always between myth and reality, and so we see a stock of Western characters from the 19th century involved in their own myth-making process.
Earp was savvy and literate enough to be able to control the telling of his own story, and he happened to be in the right place at the right time, just when the pulp fiction novelists and early filmmakers were descending on the West looking for authentic, raw material. If Earp created his own celebrityhood, it took William F. Cody to take the raw dirt of his own life and spin it into showbiz gold. Buffalo Bill was far and away the most sensationalized folk hero of Western times. His exploits as scout, Pony Express rider, and buffalo hunter were serialized in over 500 novels.
He gains his first entry onto the public stage through being a character in a dime novel. And a dime novel is one of the first mediums to popularize the West as a landscape of adventure and myth and excitement.
In 1872, Cody's future fame was assured when he appeared on stage as himself in a popular play based on his life. You could say that that was the night that the Western was born.
He had a knack for what he did, and he learned that spectacle pays and that authenticity pays, and that as someone who had actually been a scout on the prairie and who had experienced many of those Western events, he could sell his authenticity to audiences.
Buffalo Bill himself is a showman, a self-promoter. He's very aware of crafting a particular look for the audience. He makes sure that he dresses up in his best Western gear. He wears his 10-gallon hat, he wears lots of fringed clothing, and thereby creates the look of a Westerner, creates the look of a cowboy as his own. And it's this image which movie makers pick up on and run with in the 20th century.
When he wasn't acting, Cody would travel back west to scout for the U.S. Army. And in 1876, he joined General Custer's campaign to fight the Plains Indians. Custer died at the Battle of Little Bighorn on June 25, 1876. 25 days later, Cody captured and scalped a Sioux Indian chief named Yellow Hand. He managed to return to Chicago in time for the debut of his new play, which was called Buffalo Bill Shows His First Scalp to Custer, even though it should have been called Buffalo Bill Shows His First Scalp to Custer, even though Custer has been dead for 25 days. 10 years later, Cody's fame had spread across the world. His traveling Wild West show with its cast of hundreds was packing in audiences from Manchester, New Hampshire to Manchester, England. The show featured sharpshooting, rodeo riding, a recreation of a stagecoach attack. There were also sketches performed by captured Sioux Indians, for whom a life in show business was the only alternative to forced imprisonment on designated reservations. Apparently, there was no Geneva Convention in those days.
Ladies and gentlemen, permit me to introduce to you a Congress of the Rough Riders of the World.
At the turn of the 20th century, Buffalo Bill Cody was arguably the most recognizable celebrity on earth. When he died in 1917, his fame and personal fortune had diminished considerably, but his legacy was to live on in a different way.
One of the things you have to keep in mind is that Buffalo Bill laid the foundation for Western film, and he took the image of the cowboy and cleaned it up. He presented the cowboy as a possible hero, as a virtuous, hardworking American rather than a wage laborer who was also trouble for the towns that he came through.
As the days of Buffalo Bill and Wyatt Earp were coming to a close, the golden age of Hollywood was just beginning. And for a few short years, the two worlds overlapped, so that real-life characters and actual events became the main source of inspiration for filmmakers. Now, think of the Western as having three distinct stages. The most recent is the apologist stage, the stage of self-awareness, of films like Dances with Wolves, Unforgiven, Sergeant Rutledge, Cheyenne Autumn, going all the way back to the Misfits. Before that, the classical stage, the films of John Ford and Howard Hawks and Anthony Mann. And before that, the incipient stage, tales of simple moral values of good versus evil, black hats versus white hats. Why am I telling you all this? Geez, Rich, this is starting to sound like a film lecture, for Christ's sake. It's important for Brits to understand the American mystique. Britain, a nation of failed socialists, of nattering nabobs of negativity, of pessimistic pisswits, of bureaucratized, brutalized buffoons who can't even organize 11 football players into a competitive fighting unit, need to understand that America is a young country, a country built on individualism, which is why only an American cowboy can do this. Dagnabbit! Shit!
There's plenty of trails behind me, I never knew where they led. Why should I worry where I go on the crazy old trails ahead? Get along, doggies, hurry.
Early Westerns had a very simple moral code. Rescue the girl, be kind to your horse, and learn 3 chords on the guitar. As this code refined itself, the Western grew up and entered its classical period, the period of high noon and Shane. Shane is often cited as the quintessential Western because of its mythical, almost religious depiction of its hero. First time we see Alan Ladd, he's astride a horse, walking across water. First person Shane encounters is a small boy called Joey. And this scene forces us to perceive the film from a child's point of view.
You were watching me down the trail quite a spell, weren't you?
Yes, I was.
You know, I like a man who watches things go on around. Means he'll make his mark someday.
Can I offer you some water? Joey's dad is a sodbuster, one of many who came west to stake their claim when the Homestead Act was passed. Joe Sterrett and his neighbors are threatened by a local rancher who's determined to see that the open range stays that way. the local ranchers gang together and bring in a hired gunfighter, Jack Palance, to rid the area of sodbusters. And it's Shane who ultimately stands up to him.
I've heard about you.
What have you heard, Shane?
I've heard that you're a low-down Yankee liar.
In the end, Shane outdraws Palance, but he gets wounded. He rides off into the wilderness with the kid chasing after him, and of course, leaving not a dry eye in the house. Thus, Shane's character can be interpreted in one of two ways. Christ as a gunfighter, or possibly just a really good pet. Shane was released in 1952, the same year as High Noon. Howard Hawks, Bud Boetticher, Anthony Mann, Elia Kazan, Nicholas Ray, and Fritz Lang all directed westerns in 1952. Robert Mitchum, Kirk Douglas, Rock Hudson, Gary Cooper, James Stewart, Marlena Dietrich, and Marlon Brando starred in westerns in 1952. It was the year of The Lawless Breed, Rancho Notorious, The Naked Spur. In fact, 1/3 of all studio releases in 1952 were westerns. Now, how did audiences react to this golden windfall of western filmmaking? The biggest grossing western of 1952 was Son of Paleface with Bob Hope. Such a massive success of a western parody was a sure sign that audiences had grown bored of the same old cowboy stereotypes and gunfighter cliches. But one director was not prepared to let the western go down without a fight. So with The Searchers, John Ford started to kill the genre that he'd helped create. He was aware that acting styles were changing, that these brooding method freaks like Marlon Brando and James Dean, actors who had to churn through a whole Rolodex of emotions before even speaking, were emerging as Hollywood's newest stars, reflecting America's growing obsession with Freudian analysis. John Ford chose John Wayne to play the hero, but it was a completely different John Wayne than audiences were accustomed to seeing.
It's John Wayne as Ethan Edwards, who had a rare kind of courage.
The problem with The Searchers, I think, is that you have John Wayne playing essentially an anti-hero. And he's an anti-hero in two senses, both of which are quite transgressive.
Here is the story of a man, hard and relentless, tender and passionate.
One, he's in love with his brother's wife, so there's a kind of quasi-incestuous relationship at the heart of the film. But the other thing is that quite clearly he is a racist, and he says some very unpleasant things in the course of the film about his young friend Martin Pauly, who is part Indian, and about the Indians generally that they are chasing.
We've all seen Taxi Driver, a story about a social outcast, an embittered loner. In The Searchers, John Wayne's character, Ethan Edwards, isn't all that different from Travis Bickle. When the woman he can't have is killed by the Comanche, Ethan becomes obsessed with rescuing her daughters, Debbie and Lucy, who have been kidnapped by the Indians.
Never thinking of himself as martyred, never thinking of himself as brave.
So we'll find him in the end, I promise you. We'll find him.
It's this fixation that drives Ethan Edwards into a spiral of self-destruction. He becomes a danger both to himself and to those around him.
I found him. I found Lucy.
What you saw was a buck wearing Lucy's dress. I found Lucy back in the canyon.
What was she?
What do you want me to do? Draw you a picture? Spell it out? Don't ever ask me. As long as you live, don't ever ask me more.
Pretty dark for a John Wayne film. And it gets even darker. Over the 5-year period that Ethan spends looking for Debbie, he becomes more and more convinced that her enslavement by the Comanche has polluted her, both racially and sexually. Through the course of the film, his behavior crosses the line into racist and psychopathic. Travis Bickle's hatred was aimed at pimps and urban savages. Ethan's is aimed at Indians.
It was a problem for the audience and certainly for some critics to have a hero who's kind of quite explicitly racist and actually just wants to kill Indians and even wants to kill his own niece because he's afraid she's becoming an Indian. That's a big ask for the audience to, accept, really, that you accept this man as a hero. Well, what kind of a hero is he?
A man whose unconquerable will and boundless determination carved a lusty, rough, and boisterous slice of history called The Searchers.
Go, Martin, please!
Stand aside, Martin.
Oh, you don't, Ethan.
Ethan, no, you don't! Stand aside.
It's safe to say that audiences were ready for a John Wayne film. By this point, John Wayne was beyond a film star. He was a repository of national ideals, of strength, valor, steadfast courage. Instead, audiences got a film about a borderline misogynist psychopath who was in love with his brother's wife, liked to shoot Indians point blank through the eyeball, and was obsessed with saving a white girl from brainwashing non-white savages. Now, John Wayne had tremendous influence over the shaping of any character in any film he made. But here he deferred entirely to John Ford's vision. And Ford's vision was quite clearly to cast the Western in a different light. Perhaps he was trying to reflect the complex reality America was undergoing at the time. Production on The Searchers had begun a few months after the Brown versus the Board of Education ruling that allowed black students to attend whites-only schools.
The crowd moved in close and they began to follow me, calling me names. Lyncher! No nigger bitch is gonna get in our school. Get out of here!
As well as integration, many Americans were struggling to contain a fear of communism and the disconcerting realization that America was no longer infallible. See, the Korean War had ended 3 years earlier in a stalemate. That's right. The USA had won 2 big ones, and now some hick Asian country had played them to a draw. So there was a bit of trepidation going on. Critics and audiences didn't know what to make of the film. The Film Academy just threw up its hands and decided that Around the World in 80 Days, a movie about a balloon, was the best film of 1956.
No questions.
Get back. In a typical Western, it doesn't matter which side of the law you're on. It's all about how good you are with a gun. The gunfight in Westerns is pure cinematic ritual. First, it's used by the bad guys to kill the innocent. Then it's used by the good guys to kill the bad guys. And in between, it's used to foreshadow the inevitable showdown. It's a moral tool.
Good shoot. Well, I guess that fixes the Lone Rider. We better make sure.
The development of the handgun is crucial to the history of the American West.
There it is, sometimes called the gun that won the West.
That's the Peacemaker.
The Peacemaker, or the Frontier. You see the flame come out?
Yep.
That's pretty impressive at night.
Wow. I got a slight erection. Just a slight one.
Well, I'll stand over here then, if you don't mind.
Thanks to Westerns, we've all heard of the Colt Peacemaker, but the romance between cowboys and handguns had begun even earlier, in the 1830s. How did the six-shooter come about?
Samuel Colt developed a revolver much like this in 1836 called the Patterson. It looked similar to this, and it had a cylinder, and it had 5 chambers in it. And then very soon afterwards, he developed the six-shooter, or the six-gun. It was 36 caliber, it was light, it was convenient. You could carry 2 or 3 or 4 of these on your belt and still do your work. A lot of these were taken to California during the gold rush. A miner who's panning for gold and worried about Indians or claim jumpers could have a handgun on his belt all ready to go. Or if there was a rattlesnake, or if he saw some game and he wanted to take what they called a pot shot, in other words, a quick shot to put a squirrel or rabbit or something in the stew pot that night, he could do that. He wouldn't have to worry about moving and running over to get his rifle. So this is kind of the gun that put the pistol on the belt of America.
The guns went off like lightning.
But the real milestone in the history of the handgun came in 1873.
Samuel Colt came out with, well, he was dead at the time, but his company came out with the Colt Peacemaker, adopted by the United States Army. And this is the gun most closely associated with the Old West, and this is what you see all the cowboys and lawmen and gamblers carrying in the TV shows and the movies. It was first developed with the 7.5-inch barrel. This is what the Army used. And then they had the artillery model with a 5.5-inch barrel.
Right.
And then the civilian model with a 4 3/4-inch barrel.
What's the significance of changes in the size of the barrel?
Well, you could imagine if you were doing a fast draw, this was a lot easier to get out of the holster,
right.
Faster, easier to carry, easier to shove down in your waistband if you didn't have a holster.
What is that for? Why do they do that?
It just looks good. They say that God, guns, and guts made America great, and of course, the West was won very violently. The Western is a morality drama, good versus evil, a time when a man settled his problems with his fists and his gun rather than taking his opponent to court. Now, we're going to face off in the street here.
All right.
So you get over there, find a nice soft spot to fall down on. Okay, whenever you're ready, go for your gun. Go ahead and draw.
But you've already drawn.
Well, I know, but I don't have a holster to put it in.
All right. Good?
Good.
Thank you very much, Ken. That was very informative. We really appreciate it.
You're welcome. Thanks. Thanks for coming to Cemetery Hill.
All righty. Let's get out of here. Frontier people weren't obsessed with guns, they were obsessed with protection. The same is true today. Americans will buy a gun the way Brits will buy a Chubb lock. Why? It helps them sleep better at night. Americans believe almost religiously in individualism and self-reliance, and those are the two values that inform every Western film: individualism, self-reliance. Americans are very happy people. One of the reasons they're happy, they own guns. And it's very important to keep Americans happy, because they own guns. In the latter half of the 50s, America seemed to slip into a neo-conformist cocoon. The most popular film of 1956 was The Man in the Gray Flannel Suit. With an avuncular president, Eisenhower, a blistering economy, and a wonder-bred notion of suburban prosperity, America seemed to want to do nothing more than sit back in a lazy boy, put up its feet, and watch Wagon Train or Gunsmoke.
These are some of the people who share the good times and the danger in the frontier boomtown Dodge City.
By 1959, 6 of the 7 top-rated television shows in America were Westerns. And one of the stars of these shows, Clint Eastwood. A man quietly watching and learning. So while America slept, its foreign policy experts stayed vigilant. And in 1960, they were convinced that they'd found their bad guy.
America at this time is concerned about Cold War issues, and the character of Castro looms large in this narrative. In place of capitalism, he's proclaiming communism. In the face of American power, he's standing up and saying, no, you're not going to tell me what to do. I'm going to go my own way. And so he's a loose cannon, and he is an ideal outlaw to promote as this enemy of the American nation.
And so the CIA launched Operation Zapata, named after a Mexican revolutionary played by Marlon Brando in a film a few years earlier. See, Eisenhower was under the heroic but misguided notion that the majority of Cubans would willingly participate in getting rid of Castro if only they had outside help. He authorized the CIA to begin covertly training and equipping Cuban guerrillas to overthrow the bearded bad guy. In the same year, cinema-goers were flocking to see The Magnificent Seven.
777, the Magnificent Seven. They were only 7, but they fought like 700. Bring the kind of justice that would last.
Ride on.
Right on. Somehow I don't think you solved my problem.
Solving your problems isn't in our line. We deal in lead, friend.
So do I. We're in the same business, huh?
Only as competitors.
Magnificent Seven was directed by John Sturges, adapted from Kurosawa's Seven Samurai. It portrays, somewhat idealistically, a group of men with shady pasts who come to the aid of the peasants, teaching them to defend themselves and trying to instill a newfound dignity. But things don't always go so smoothly in real life. President Kennedy came into office in 1961 and inherited Operation Zapata. But he immediately became obsessed with what he called plausible deniability of the whole escapade. He changed the invasion site from the Escambray Mountains to the Playa Girón, Bay of Pigs. And he refused to provide enough air support for the guerrillas. In short, as the British like to say, he bottled it. With Castro fully aware of the plan, the guerrillas and their CIA-backed mercenaries walked straight into a trap. In the ensuing battle, 4 Americans and 68 guerrillas were killed. The Cuban forces captured another 1,209 guerrillas, and a month later, traded them to the U.S. for 500 bulldozers. Besides trying to paint a romantic notion of America's Cold War policy, the Magnificent Seven is also notable for another reason. It establishes the notion of group heroics.
They were only 7, but they fought like 700 to bring the kind of justice that would last. They made a brave stand, the Magnificent Seven. They fought for the future to wipe away their past.
We're never really told much about these men's background. They just seem to be adrift, as if their very reasons for existing is starting to play itself out. See, the Western hero is essentially a tragedian. His actions are always toward the betterment and protection of the community, but these are also actions that will ultimately render his skills obsolete. And the men of the Magnificent Seven seem to be aware of this.
The gun has got you everything you have. Isn't that true? Isn't it true?
Yeah, sure, everything. After a while, you can call bartenders and faro dealers by their first name. Maybe 200 of them. Rented rooms you live in, 500. Meals you eat in hash houses, 1,000. Home, none. Wife, none. Kids, none. Prospects, 0. Suppose I left anything out?
The Magnificent Seven.
In the same year that audiences were thrilling to the action and adventure of the Magnificent Seven, a different kind of Western came out, one that twisted the genre almost completely out of shape.
This man is Arthur Miller, one of the great playwrights of our time, winner of the Pulitzer Prize. This man is John Huston, 2-time Academy Award winner. These giants of the entertainment world have combined their talents to create an outstanding motion picture.
The Misfits, directed by John Huston, plops the Western down into a completely contemporary setting, painting its characters as pure anachronism. The Misfits of the title applies both to the wild Mustangs of Nevada and to the no-hope Wranglers who try to round them up just to earn enough money to get by.
Shock him down, Guido!
What's truly significant about the Misfits was its employment of a modernist and profoundly literate screenwriter, Arthur Miller. See, up to this point, most Westerns had simply used landscape as a backdrop for adventure. What Miller did was to use the Western backdrop, in this case Nevada, as a way to explore its effect on character, because the Misfits are reprobates. They're excluded from community, and they're forced to eke out a living in the harsh scrubland. The film takes Western stereotypes and turns them on their head. Eli Wallach, who had donned mustache and sombrero as Calvera in The Magnificent Seven, here plays Guido, one of 3 men vying for the affections of Rosalind.
The screen's most exciting woman, Marilyn Monroe.
The others are an aging cowboy named Gay Langland, played by Clark Gable.
I don't feel that way about you, Gay.
Well, don't get discouraged, girl. You might.
And a burned-out rodeo rider named Perce, played by Montgomery Clift. All three men fall under Monroe's charm, trying to exploit both her vulnerability and her optimism. In The Misfits, there's no longer a place in the West for noble qualities or cowboy heroics. It's a shock to discover that the characters are rounding up horses, not to break in and ride, but to sell as dog food. They can't even walk into a bar and get involved in a good old-fashioned fight over some minor injustice.
All right, come on outside, Jack. Yeah. What's the trouble?
Misfit also applies to the cast's behavior throughout the film's making. Most of them were hardly less tormented in real life than their on-screen characters. During production, Marilyn Monroe's marriage to husband Arthur Miller had begun to disintegrate. Filming to be stopped to accommodate her overdosing on pills. Montgomery Clift's mood swings and psycho-incommunicated behavior would pave the way for future phone tossers like Russell Crowe. Director Huston was drinking fairly heavily himself, and Clark Gable, spry at 59, insisted on doing his own wrangling stunts. This quite possibly precipitated the heart attack that would kill him 2 weeks later. It was also Marilyn Monroe's last film. Shortly after completing The Misfits, she took a lot more pills and died. So The Misfits paved the way in Western filmmaking for more highbrow writing. Highbrow. What does that mean? Writing that creates more forehead action in the reader. What I mean is more realistic, where the characters are products, distinct products of their environment.
Combine these outstanding talents in a shattering story of people caught in a flood of emotional cross-currents. And the result is The Misfits.
Suddenly we had a whole flood of other kinds of stories about the particularities of life in the West. And while they still had some trace of that mythological story that comes to us from way back in the past, now we're getting a lot of stories that are much closer to the bone, much closer to the reality of experience in the West. These were not stylized lives. These were not lives that somehow came out of metaphoric storytelling. These were actual complex lives like we tend to lead.
2 years after The Misfits, Larry McMurtry adapted his critically acclaimed novel Horsemen Pass By into a screenplay.
But how'd a man like you come to be a son to me?
Well, that's easy. I was no bundle left on a doorstep. Wasn't found in no bulrushes. You got the same feelings below your belt as any other man. So you got stuck with me for a son.
HUD is a stark portrayal of a man rebelling against Western ideals. And the remarkable thing about the central character is that through the course of the film, he remains unchanged. There's no crisis of confidence, no redemption, no character arc. He's just a cocky, unscrupulous, womanizing Cadillac cowboy.
Did you ever ask? Well, the only question I ever ask any woman is, what time is your husband coming home?
HUD is at idealistic odds with his dad. Homer Bannon, played by Melvin Douglas, is a moral patriarch, a man who sternly represents the work ethic of the Western rancher. When the cows contract hoof and mouth disease, HUD wants to sell them before the government finds out.
You don't care about people, HUD. You don't give a damn about them.
Granddad?
You live just for yourself. And that makes you not fit to live with.
Now why then, if the main character is such a jerk, do we still feel sympathy for him? Well, years of conditioned film watching have taught us to romanticize the Western myth. HUD is a realist. The Western myth is lost on him. He has no capacity to romanticize it. For that reason, we feel sorry for him. In both HUD and The Misfits, the Old West is lost, irreplaceable. There seems to be nowhere for the characters in those films to look but backwards. In contrast, The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance casts the action in the Old West, but clearly predicts a loss of faith in government and acknowledges the casual brutalism of the Western.
Out of the flame and fury of the frontier, the Old West lives again, as only John Ford can recreate it.
Made in 1962, the film marked John Ford's return to directing Westerns. But gone are the epic landscapes, the VistaVision, and the Technicolor. This is a stark, almost expressionist world. As if for Ford, the vibrant, colorful days of the frontier are now reduced to gray. In Liberty Valance, James Stewart plays Ransom Stoddard, a senator returning to the town of Shinbone to attend the funeral of an old friend. Stewart had been associated primarily with the westerns of Anthony Mann, films like Winchester 73 and The Man from Laramie. Mann's films were notable for portraying their antagonist as somewhat tormented, driven to almost irrational acts of revenge. But in Liberty Valance, Stewart's Ransom Stoddard represents something entirely different. He codifies the arrival of civilized order that Ford promised at the end of My Darling Clementine. When Stoddard first arrives in Shinbone, he's armed with nothing but Eastern knowledge. His stagecoach is robbed by the ironically named Liberty Valance, Lee Marvin in one of his snarliest roles.
You got a choice, dishwasher. Either you get out of town, or tonight you be out in that street alone.
From then on, most of Liberty Valance takes place indoors, in kitchens, schoolrooms, newspaper offices. No spectacle, no inspired landscapes.
You all heard him say he had a gun in his hand, didn't you? I didn't say that. That ain't murder, Mr. Marshall. That's a clean-cut case of self-defense.
The presence of Liberty Valance signifies a threat to Shinbone's harmony. Ford contrasts Stoddard's peaceful nature with John Wayne's Tom Donovan. Wayne plays Tom Donovan like John Wayne. He teaches Stoddard that in the West, when freedom is at stake, guns are still the most effective way of protection.
I don't want to kill him. I want to put him in jail.
Oh. Well, I know those law books mean a lot to you, but not out here. Out here, a man settles his own problems.
Ransom takes a job at Shinbone's local eatery and begins searching his law books for a way to prosecute Valance legally. Ford's intent seems to be to treat the Eastern notion of civilized law and order as something akin to forced femininity.
Of them all, two are the most memorable. Liberty Valance and The Man Who Shot Him.
That's my stake, Valance.
You heard him, dude. Pick it up.
I said you, Liberty. You pick it up.
Stoddard reluctantly sheds his Eastern values and gets drawn into a gunfight with Liberty Valance.
All right, dude. This time, right between the eyes.
There's a twist. It's not Stoddard shooting Liberty, it's Tom Donovan, hidden in an alleyway. Because no one is quite sure what really happened, this lawless act establishes Stoddard as a hero, and he goes on to be elected to statehood, which allows him to implement the civilized values he first stood for. Toward the end of the film, Stoddard finds out the truth, but it's too late to do anything about it. The revelation of the false past has established a man's political trajectory. Too much time has passed to change anything. The people believe what they're told. Even the newspaper, the local so-called beacon of truth, refuses to print the story. The values of Shinbone have been built on a lie. Liberty Valance represents John Ford's attempts to atone for his past violent transgressions. Guy was getting up there in years. Maybe felt the need to re-examine all the gore and destruction and racism that he painted so gleefully in earlier films, where Indians, standing in for black people, were murdered indiscriminately. A few years earlier, he'd made a film called Sergeant Rutledge, in which a black cavalry officer, played by Woody Strode, is charged and then cleared of the murder and rape of a white woman. In that film, Sergeant Rutledge's impeccable service record is invoked through flashbacks, so we know he's an honorable soldier because he's killed a lot of Indians. So having apologized for racism, Ford made his last Western in 1964, Cheyenne Autumn. It charts the 1,800-mile trek of the Cheyenne Nation from their forced government reservation in Oklahoma back to their native homeland on the Yellowstone River.
The less than 300 men, women, and children fought a fantastic running battle with an army of more than 10,000 bluecoats in a seemingly hopeless exodus to their Yellowstone homeland nearly 1,500 miles away. These are the heroes of this epic story.
Ford claimed his desire for Cheyenne Autumn was to portray Indians magnificent in their stoical dignity. But the film was also about Ford's own autumn. He was 70 now, an age maybe where he felt the need to apologize. This kind of late career crisis would turn up in directors to come. Unforgiven would be Clint Eastwood's answer to Sudden Impact. Spielberg's Saving Private Ryan is an answer to Jaws. You can't just keep killing people pornographically. Sooner or later, Quentin Tarantino is going to have to make a film about orphan puppies.
He has given the world a cavalcade of memorable film classics spanning more than 40 years.
John Ford's film career lasted over 50 years, twice as long as the frontier period itself. If there's an abiding historical statement to his work, it's this: that both violence and the suppression of violence are crucial to nation building. If John Ford is the godfather of the Western film, then Sam Peckinpah is its enfant terrible. He's infamous for bringing a whole new dimension to on-screen violence with films like Straw Dogs, The Wild Bunch, Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid. There's a very famous story about Sam Peckinpah once getting drunk and trying to get his horse into this hotel elevator and up to his room. The horse got stuck, died of a heart attack, and they had to dismantle the entire elevator to get it out. Now, this is the West. A man should be able to get a horse into his hotel room, but the elevator represents the ever-shrinking frame of the open frontier, constricting both horse and rider, and ultimately leaving him bereft of the very tools of his own invention. Quite possibly the most overstretched metaphor ever used for a Western. But what the hell? Peckinpah had forged his directing skills in TV as the creator of The Rifleman and The Westerner. He once said, "I've never made a Western. I've made a lot of films about men on horseback." With Ford's eminence coming to a close, Peckinpah became the predominant Western director of the 60s and 70s. His artistic arrival coincided with a point where America was pretty much becoming afraid of its own shadow. The purpose of a good film is to haunt us, and the best way to haunt us on film is to reflect the fears of real life, the expansion of cultures and ideals that seem foreign and evil. You know, Muslims. Today, that fear is primarily terrorism. In Peckinpah's time, it was the communist threat in Southeast Asia.
Anti-war demonstrators protest U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War in mass marches, rallies, and demonstrations.
The nation was divided between those who saw the troops as heroes and those who considered them murderers and villains. There was both a militant glee and a tragic sense of waste and failure in the gore and violence of Vietnam, and the same is true of Peckinpah's characters. In 1969, Peckinpah made The Wild Bunch. It was his own personal view of an evil world disguised as a Western film.
Driven to the border by the irresistible thrust of civilization were the remnants of the breed that had made the West wild. If they move, kill them. Payrolls were harder to get at.
It showed that man, even heroic man, can be an animal, that his fate is within himself, and that America's standing in the world, its power and menace, owes more to basic natural evil than individual heroics.
At that time, America's feelings about itself as a nation during the time of the Vietnam War obviously were very complex and contradictory, but nevertheless we did not feel good about ourselves necessarily like we did at the end of the Second World War. And the Western mirrored that, I think, that kind of complex thing. Everybody was an outlaw in 1969 or 70. We all were. Everybody in this room was an outlaw of some kind or another. We were all doing some outlaw thing, thinking outlaw thoughts, if nothing else.
But there were still a few trails for the kind who'd be cold before they were tame. They called them the Wild Bunch. Pike had been a gentleman of principle.
In the Wild Bunch, Peckinpah is attempting to show the brutality of conflict, to show that a gunfight is not honorable and glorious, but it's nasty and it shows human nature at its worst.
Cash went for his gun at the moment the war whoop started. The Colt jumped swiftly into his hand. Duke was having trouble, but his right hand acted like a separate part of him. His Smith & Wesson appeared over the pommel of his saddle with the speed of a striking rattler. Yeah. Here's how Sam Peckinpah shows you the same thing. It's fairly easy to see that of all the elements of a Western, the most impactful to transfer to screen is violence. What Peckinpah brought to the Western was a new filmic vocabulary, slow-motion deaths, choreographed shootouts, long, velvety ropes of blood arcing across the screen, violence as ballet. What he knew was that stylized violence, rather than turn the audience away, would make them complicit. Over the years, he developed a style of filmmaking that compelled and repelled viewers in equal measure. The great debate about screen violence often cites Sam Peckinpah as its source, and any sanctimonious asshole will try to draw a line from Sam Peckinpah through to Son of Sam, or the Columbine Killers, or the Virginia Tech gunmen, all of whose behavior has been based on glorified screen violence. But the truth is that Sam Peckinpah's enactments of violence were much closer to showing the reality of pain and death than, say, any of those hokey staged death scenes from the 30s and 40s. Plus, anyone who sees real-life violence as an outgrowth of screen violence is just too dirt stupid to realize how completely ridiculous on-screen violence is. Take, for example, the famous barroom brawl. What makes this fight so watchable? Because real fights never look like this. The Western barroom brawl always resembles what happened after the story has been recounted about 1,000 times. Peckinpah simply transferred this operatic approach to gunfights. And they were very entertaining to watch, especially since you could see lots of real death on the evening news. But the real West wasn't nearly as violent as films have portrayed it. The murder rate in Western towns wasn't as high as back east. Not nearly as many Indians were massacred as sympathizers want you to believe. But all Westerns are dependent on climactic violence. And it was Peckinpah who brought that violence to a whole new artistic and technical level. The Western is probably the most quintessentially American of all film genres. So it's ironic that the man who was responsible for some of the most commercially successful Westerns of all time was an Italian. With the last bit of Puritan ethos squeezed from the Western, it's no surprise that Europeans would begin to plunder the genre. After all, they're godless people with fractured self-identities who tend to view their own existence as some sort of barren post-apocalyptic landscape where Catholic death looms just over the horizon. You know, Spain. Sergio Leone reinvented the Western to the same extent that Sergio Valente reinvented blue jeans. In other words, he just found a way to make them really, really cheap. He found cheap, exploitable film crews in Spain, and he found a cheap, exploitable actor in Clint Eastwood. In fact, the Sergio Leone film was pretty much like putting a closed-circuit television in a sweatshop and just letting it run. He created a style that was instantly a parody of itself. It had nothing to do with the American West, neither the real nor the mythological one. Various cinephiles have tried to champion Leone as some kind of messiah of Western filmmaking. In fact, a woman named Marcia Landi, in a book called Americanism and the Italian Western, I'm not sure what Americanism is, had this to say about spaghetti Westernism. A phenomenon that is larger than the geographical and cultural boundaries of the United States and its Cold War domination, coming to represent worldwide transformations and conflicts. Really? I thought it was just a guy who the scriptwriter hadn't even bothered to name, shooting some other guy because his words didn't match his lip movements. The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly takes place in Texas during the Civil War. Never mind that Texas wasn't actually involved in the Civil War. At the beginning of the film, we're introduced to three characters.
The good. The bad. The ugly.
This saves the actors the chore of actually having to convey these qualities through acting. Not to mention the fact that the good guy is actually a lot badder than the bad guy, and that the bad guy is uglier than the ugly guy, but the ugly guy is not badder than the better guy. I don't know. Throw in a few quasi-Marxist musings about class struggle, and basically you have a Sergio Leone film. Leone would eventually move to Hollywood, where some real money got thrown at his productions. And love him or hate him, one thing's for sure. His undeniable contribution to Western filmmaking was in allowing Clint Eastwood a first-hand observation of the creative process.
A drifter came riding out of the West. You know him as Clint Eastwood. The citizens of Largo didn't know him at all.
High Plains Drifter was his first attempt at directing a Western.
What did you say your name was again?
I didn't.
It's a dark, sardonic story with a supernatural twist. The opening scene evokes the man with no-name character. Dark, silhouetted figure, funereal music, and lots of high-angle shots that emphasize the community as something to be pitied, but beneath the hero's contempt. In fact, Eastwood is simply bringing the no-name character to its logical conclusion, the Angel of Death.
They didn't know him when he drifted into town. Now they'll never forget him.
The nihilism and undisguised contempt of Eastwood's character for the civilized West is a response to Gunfighter as anachronism. We have come a long way since My Darling Clementine, when Wyatt Earp is insulted by a saloon singer and simply chooses to ignore her. Eastwood's response to insult is a bit more aggressive. He drags the girl off to a barn and rapes her.
You know what you are. You're an animal.
Well, you have a way of bringing that out.
Eastwood kept the overriding pessimism of Leone's films, but he threw out all the metaphors and surrealism. The film's central nemesis is the community itself. The great, shining vision of Ford's Tombstone has turned into dystopia, festering with greed, corruption, and amorality.
One man against one town. Not bad odds.
About time this town has a new sheriff. I'm the sheriff. And the mayor. I'm the mayor. Any objections?
Only Eastwood could get away with turning a character this dark into a hero, and it would be Eastwood's pulling power at the box office that would play a big part in keeping the Western alive through the lean years to come. Eastwood might have brought the Western back to America in the early 70s, but when he got here, he found that directors like Arthur Penn and Robert Altman had changed it. McCabe and Mrs. Miller is not only one of the greatest Westerns ever made, it also paints a far truer picture of expansionist economics than any of Sergio Leone's gas-headed dissertations on class struggle.
It's true that all the men you knew were dealers.
It was Robert Altman's first Western, and from the outset, he was consciously attempting to destroy what he called the myths of heroism in the Old West.
Guiding the film is Robert Altman, who has established himself as an exceptional director. In this picture, he needs a crude and uncomfortable setting to film this first meeting between a tough businesswoman and her new partner.
You're Joe McCabe? Mrs. Miller. Come from Bedford to see you.
Altman's use of grubby exteriors and natural lighting convinced many viewers they were watching a real Western. They weren't, of course. They were watching a brilliantly reimagined Western in which the anti-hero struggles in his own way to better his community. McCabe is an affable pimp with no business skills whatsoever. When Mrs. Miller, an experienced madam, arrives, played by Julie Christie, she offers to run the whorehouse properly, and they form a partnership.
I'm talking about a proper sporting house with class girls and clean linen and proper hygiene.
Well, I don't think you're going to find my clientele up here too interested in that sort of thing.
They will be once they get a taste of it.
Presbyterian Church is an infant mining town, and the success of the whorehouse is its first baby steps toward economic maturity. The whorehouse brings better hygiene, better housing, better work conditions. Seems as if Altman is striving not for realism, but for a kind of purity of the infallibility of the human condition.
To film a story of 125 men facing those odds, fighting the elements, the loneliness, and their enemies, a movie company has come to British Columbia to start from scratch, as they did, to build the mining town of Presbyterian Church. They began
The theme of nascent communities struggling to assert itself echoes My Darling Clementine. But unlike Wyatt Earp, Warren Beatty's McCabe isn't providing a peacekeeping service. He's providing a real service. Two representatives of a large mining company arrive to buy out McCabe and Miller's enterprise. McCabe refuses, and the two guys, though not necessarily bad themselves, are very aware of the lengths that their company will go to get what it wants.
I got better offers than that from Monkey Ward. So now if you boys want to talk business with me, what you got to do is you got to get your offer way up there in the air where it belongs. Smalley, set up that no-limit game for me, will you? Well, man, what do you think of that?
He's a real smart-ass, he is.
In essence, McCabe is just a small-time businessman standing up for free enterprise. And we know that that will lead to his death, because that's the ultimate price you pay for standing up to corporate evil. Also because we keep hearing Leonard Cohen's music in the background.
I know that kind of man. It's hard to hold the hand of anyone who's reaching for the sky just to surrender.
The film is full of overlapping dialogue and half-mumbled monologues. It's a depersonalized film that refuses to allow us to project our preconceptions of Westerns onto it. And there's never been a film quite like it.
Robert Altman is ready to film one of the dramatic events in the movie. Presbyterian Church has developed into a flourishing town, and McCabe the richest man. Outsiders menace his operations, and he has to face them alone.
The arrival of 3 hired killers sent by the mining corporation shows how big business bends the rules of fair trade just to suit its own needs.
During the filming of this climactic sequence, every building will be used. It is director Altman's and designer Erickson's painstaking care that makes the scene pay off.
The final scene in the film, where the townspeople unite to extinguish the burning church while McCabe takes on the hired killers, sets the reverse Puritanism right.
Well, I'm going right now. I got to have my gun. Them men out there trying to kill me. Get out.
No one steps in to help him, not even Mrs. Miller. And it's obvious McCabe has to be sacrificed for the future of the community. Altman's unheroic vision of the old frontier received a mixed reception from critics and filmgoers. Perhaps Americans had enough to worry about. It was 1971, and America was still reeling from the findings of the My Lai massacre trial. The truth of how a platoon of U.S. infantrymen had ruthlessly murdered hundreds of innocent Vietnamese women and children was making international headlines. That incident marked the blackest moment of U.S. involvement in Vietnam. The soldiers, supposedly giving their lives for our freedom, reduced to savages. 5 years later, with America's Vietnam policy a certified shambles, Little Big Man hit the screens.
Bonnie and Clyde and Alice's Restaurant has created 15 reels of motion picture entertainment called Little Big Man.
Little Big Man is less about individual and community than about civilizations. Dustin Hoffman plays Jack Crabb, a 121-year-old veteran of the Western frontier, recounting his life story to an historian.
111 years ago, when I was 10 years old.
Between 1858 and 1878, Jack Crabb was an Indian warrior, a preacher's ward, a gunfighter, a drunkard, a hermit, and he tried to kill General Custer.
Take him away and hang him.
And you can believe as much of that as you want.
Arthur Penn's film tells us point blank to believe everything we hear and nothing we see. Jack Crabb's life veers back and forth between Indian and white adoption, between polite society and frontier life, between meetings with imagined people and real figures of history.
Dustin Hoffman and Wild Bill Hickok, Reel 9.
Eventually, Crabb's identity becomes so muddled he no longer seems to know who or what he's a part of anymore.
Got to cut your throat to get it through your head. I'm a white man. White? Sure I'm white.
He's a failure at being white, and he's a failure at being an Indian, or, as they call themselves, human beings.
What's interesting about Little Big Man, particularly, is the way it conceives of the Indians. It's clearly a film very much of the time when it's made, so that the Indians are portrayed more or less as hippies, basically. They practice free love, they're very tolerant of this gay Indian, the old Indian who Little Big Man is befriended by, is a very kind of spiritual figure.
Dustin Hoffman, Reel 2.
These were human beings, my son. And now they're dead, rubbed out by those ugly, unnatural creatures.
Why would they kill women and children?
Because they are strange. They do not seem to know where the center of the earth is. We must have a war on these cowards and teach them a lesson.
The film is a proxy canvas for America's Vietnam policy of the 70s. Shows no reverence for cowboys or Indians. It just views genocide as America's national project. Crabb witnesses his adopted Indian family wiped out by General Custer, played by Richard Mulligan, a vainglorious popinjay, the Western equivalent of Turgidson in Dr. Strangelove. Crabb decides to exact revenge on Custer, but loses his nerve. Instead of punishing his would-be assassin, Custer lets Crabb go. His life is not worth the reversal of a Custer decision. And there again is the obsession with plausibility that characterizes U.S. foreign policy.
It's pretty clear that that figure of Custer represents, the kind of mood of anti-militarism that was arising in America as a result of the constant depiction of the Vietnam War on television.
Dustin Hoffman and General Custer, Reel 13.
Take my advice. Go west.
My wife, she's awful scared of Indians.
My dear woman, you have nothing to fear from the Indians. I give you my personal guarantee.
In films, as in real life, the cavalry is exonerated. Wars continue to this day because leaders can't risk losing face by reversing their decisions. Little Big Man is the West asking to be remembered, heeded, spilling its story so epically that in the end it slumps from its own exhaustion.
For Christian America, let your arrows fly, savages! I am on board!
By now, the Western was more or less spitting up blood and looking for a soft place to fall. Sam Peckinpah's last Western, made in 1973, acknowledges more than any other Western film that its glory days are over. Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid is the story of two famous gunfighters, former friends, now forced to confront each other.
Now Sam Peckinpah, the director who unleashed the Wild Bunch, takes a hard new look at two old friends, Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid. They were legends in their own time.
Both know that not only are they doomed, but that the mythology that promoted them is doomed as well, and both are acutely aware of their notoriety.
I didn't catch your name.
Didn't give it out.
Well, I guess that's why I didn't catch it.
But I know yourn, and that's enough.
The values of honor and valor that we've come to appreciate in Western films seem bankrupt now. Even the supporting characters seem devoid of any true substance. They all look like sidekicks in somebody else's Western, posturing and striking poses as if they have nothing better to do than stand around and wait for the inevitable showdown between Pat and Billy.
William H. Bonney. He killed 21 men.
I don't want to kill you, Bill.
No, I sure hope you don't, Billy. And he was just a kid. Billy the Kid.
Sheriff Pat Garrett.
Adios.
Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid. Legends in their own time. But time was running out.
Peckinpah seemed to know that America in 1973 was at least a generation removed from anyone who would take a Western seriously. So he challenged young viewers to connect with the film by casting counterculture musicians. People like Christopherson, Rita Coolidge, and of course, Bob Dylan, who also scored the film. In fact, Dylan's character, Alias, was never even written into the original script.
They say that Pat Garrett got your number. Your sleep with one eye open when you wonder.
Peckinpah used Dylan to create a self-distancing effect in the moviegoer, to show how the iconography of all the characters replaced any sense of true function. And using Dylan's music over and over again, he created a lament, a kind of death poem for the Western.
There's guns across the river about to pound you.
He gathered up every recognizable cowboy character actor he could find to populate the film. Jack Elam, Chill Wills, Richard Jekyll, Slim Pickens, Katie Girardo, as if lining them up for one farewell cameo before the Western expired.
6.
Mama, take this badge off of me.
Slim Pickens, who whooped into infamy astride an atomic bomb in Dr. Strangelove, here just limps to the waterside and dies quietly.
It's getting dark, too dark to see. Feel I'm knocking up on heaven's door.
The decline of the West as a theme in the movies seems to go hand in hand with the decline of the Western itself, as though the Western, as it disappears, is starting to feel nostalgic for itself almost, and for the setting that gave rise to it.
Knock, knock, knocking on heaven's door.
Very few remarkable Westerns have been made since 1973. The constant search for new and different approaches was wearing thin. The conventional wisdom is that the Western was killed off in 1980 by Heaven's Gate, but that's not true, because you can't kill something that's already dead. However, the film that probably buried the Western came out in 1974. The pure joke count and knowing references of Mel Brooks' Blazing Saddles show just how overripe the Western genre had become.
He rode a blazing saddle, he wore a shining star. His job to offer battle to bad men near and far.
The heroic sheriff rallies his citizens in the wildest finish the West has ever seen, or the movies have ever shown.
Ow! Oh! Ow! Have you ever seen such cruelty?
Mama put my guns in the ground. I can't shoot them anymore.
For the next 15 years, Hollywood largely turned its back on the Western. But that doesn't mean that there wasn't a cowboy watching over the range.
What's interesting about the late 70s and 80s is, although you have the decline of the Western, and Heaven's Gate in 1980 is a complete flop and nobody goes to see it, it loses enormous amounts of money. But at the same time, you have a cowboy in the White House, so people get their Western kicks from the political arena rather than the movies.
Knock, knock, knocking on heaven's door. Knock, knock, knocking on heaven's door.
On the 4th of July weekend of 1976, as America was turning 200 years old, 3 westerns were released. One was The Missouri Breaks. The others were Clint Eastwood's The Outlaw Josie Wales and The Shootist with John Wayne. None did particularly well at the box office. In retrospect, maybe it was the final salvo of the Western as anything more than an anomaly. But then again, you never know.
This land is your land, and this land is my land, from California to the New York Island.
Every once in a while, a director comes along and decides he'll have a shot at a Western, but for the most part, they're just modern sensibilities dressed up in spurs. All hat and no cattle, as they like to say. Today, the only remaining viable Western director is Clint Eastwood. With Unforgiven, he proved that there's still a story to be told out there, but nowadays, you have to find your own audience. There's no built-in fan base for Westerns anymore. There's only a built-in fan base for Clint Eastwood. With Unforgiven, he managed to create an extremely layered story that still reminded us how valid the iconography of the West is. In a sense, he reclaimed the Western for all of us, if only briefly. And the scene in which Gene Hackman kicks the living shit out of Richard Harris for trying to impose some royalist ownership of America's past is a thing of beauty.
You been talking about the Queen again? On Independence Day?
Essentially, the message is, we may not make Westerns anymore, but we still own them, by God.
The Western will always have a function in American society. It is the genre which Americans can go to for security, for comfort, for a sense of their own imagined past, and an identity which is simple, triumphal, and much less complicated in thinking about 21st century terrorism.
You can still make Westerns, but you have to basically have a sense of, in what way you're going to be different from what's gone before. I don't think you can just make them straight, like the same as they used to be made.
It's no shock that since Franklin D. Roosevelt, only 3 of our presidents haven't cited Westerns as their favorite films. For the record, Jimmy Carter's favorite film was Gone with the Wind, technically not a Western. For John F. Kennedy, it was Casablanca. And for Gerald Ford, Home Alone. I'm sorry, that's not a joke. We live in a world where people walk around all day staring into their phones. Westerns are gone, because the essential ingredient of all art is memory. And we're at least 2 generations removed from the filmgoers who saw Westerns as a creative and shaping force of America's history, identity, and culture. Our next president, whoever that turns out to be, will of course begin to reshape policy. It will be interesting to see if she or he is the last president to invoke the Western into personal character or public policy. The Western film remains appreciated, both in its own right and for its influence on modern films of any genre. You don't get Taxi Driver without The Searchers. You don't get Forrest Gump without Little Big Man. You don't get Reservoir Dogs without The Wild Bunch. In a sense, the Western is like America itself. It endures. It just doesn't prevail anymore.
Well, you're not going to use the story, Mr. Scott?
No, sir. This is the West, sir. When the legend becomes fact, print the legend.
He's right, Gramps.
The BBC Proms continues with coverage from the Royal Albert Hall as Thierry Fischer conducts Shostakovich's Leningrad Symphony, presented by Susie Klein, tomorrow from 7:30 here on BBC4. Next tonight, though, classic movies with Fort Apache.